human pulls alien girl from a bioflare surge, then the surge curves back toward human. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main character. Max Hunter stood in the midst of the chaos, his breath coming in shallow gasps as the bioflare surge raged around him. The air shimmered with the intense heat of the storm, and his body was covered in a thin layer of sweat, the temperature skyrocketing beyond anything he had ever experienced. The red light from the flare danced across the sky like an angry beast, leaving Max with little time to think or act. The alien landscape was desolate, the barren land cracked open by the surge heat. His mind was focused only on the task ahead, saving the life of the alien girl lying unconscious in the swirling storm. Zyra, an alien with deep blue skin and silver hair, was no match for the overwhelming power of the bioflare surge. Her body lay motionless, her breathing shallow, her chest rising and falling with difficulty as the storm closed in on her. Max knew he had to act fast. His suit systems were already calculating the quickest route, but the storm was unpredictable, and every second was a risk. He moved toward her, his heavy boots thudding against the cracked earth, the wind howling in his ears. His fingers trembled as he reached for her, the heat from the surge making his suit systems overload. With a quick motion, he scooped her into his arms, ignoring the burn of the heat against his suit. She felt fragile in his grasp, and for a moment, Max hesitated. He knew the risks. He knew he might not make it out of this alive. But Zyra needed him, and he couldn't leave her to die in this hellish storm. He turned and sprinted toward the shelter he'd spotted earlier, the storm's winds pushing against him, threatening to knock him off course. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins as he held Zyra tightly. With each step, the bioflare surge seemed to grow stronger, its power feeding on the environment, and Max felt the pressure building around him. Just when he thought he might reach safety, the surge, almost like a living thing, shifted course. A blast of heat slammed into his back, knocking the air out of him. He stumbled, his footing slipping, and for a brief moment, everything went black. Max fought to stay conscious, the storm's energy swirling around him like a tempest. His mind was foggy, but his instinct screamed at him to move. He had to keep moving. The surge was relentless, and it seemed to know he was carrying Zyra. A sickening feeling twisted in his stomach as he realized the surge was following them, not done with its destructive path. He gritted his teeth and pushed forward, his body screaming in protest. Zyra's weight in his arms became a heavy burden, but he couldn't stop. Not now. The storm roared, and the energy from the flare surged toward him once again, more powerful than before. Max knew they were running out of time. His mind raced with strategies, calculations, and the desperate hope that he could find a way to protect them both. But with every step, the surge came closer, and the storm pressed in tighter. He couldn't outrun it forever. With a final, exhausting effort, Max stumbled into the shelter, just as the surge roared behind him, its heat licking at his heels. The door slammed shut, and the two were safe, for now. Zyra stirred in his arms, her body warming against his chest as the storm raged outside. Max's breathing was ragged, his heart still pounding. He glanced down at her, his grip tightening around her small form, and he knew that no matter what came next, he would fight to protect her from the storm, and from whatever followed. Max stumbled backward, bracing himself against the heavy door, his body trembling from the aftershocks of the surge. He could feel the heat still radiating from the outside, the bioflare surge pressing against the shelter's walls as though it wanted to rip through and continue its wrath. His breath came in ragged gasps, the adrenaline beginning to wear off, leaving him feeling exhausted and worn. He glanced down at Zyra, her blue skin glowing faintly in the dim light of the shelter. She was still unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. The storm outside raged on, but for now, they were safe. Max knelt beside her, his movements careful, not wanting to cause her any more harm. His fingers brushed against her silver hair, the soft strands warm under his touch. Her body was limp, and her chest rose and fell in a slow rhythm. For a moment, Max just sat there, watching her, his mind racing. He had done it, he had saved her from the surge, but now, the real challenge had only just begun. He wasn't sure how long they could stay here, hidden in this shelter, with the storm outside still swirling in a violent fury. His suit systems were struggling to keep up, the temperature inside steadily rising as the flare's effects crept closer. Max knew they couldn't stay here for too long. He needed to find a way to move, to get to somewhere safer. But first, he had to make sure Zyra was all right. He checked her pulse, his fingers pressing lightly against the soft skin of her wrist. It was faint, but steady. She wasn't dying. That was something, at least. He had to admit, he was worried. He had never faced a situation quite like this before, and even though his training had prepared him for hostile environments and dangerous missions, nothing had ever quite felt like this. Zyra stirred slightly, a soft groan escaping her lips as she shifted in her sleep. Max leaned closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He could see her eyes fluttering open, her long lashes trembling as she slowly regained consciousness. Her gaze fixed on him, her silver eyes wide with confusion. For a brief moment, she just stared at him, as though trying to make sense of the situation. Then, slowly, her lips parted, her voice weak but steady. Why did you save me?" The question caught Max off guard. It was a simple question, but one that carried so much weight. He had acted instinctively, driven by the need to protect her, to keep her safe from the storm. But hearing her ask it made him pause. He hadn't thought much about it until now. He hadn't stopped to wonder why. Because it's the right thing to do, he said simply, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts in his head. He wasn't sure if that was the right answer, but it was all he could give. Zyra didn't respond immediately. She just looked at him, as though weighing his words, her eyes searching his face for something. Her expression softened slightly, and for a moment, Max thought he saw a flicker of understanding in her gaze. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Max nodded, his chest tightening at the sincerity in her words. She didn't have to thank him. He had done what anyone would have done in his place. Or so he thought. But the way she looked at him now, with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something more complicated, made him feel something he hadn't expected, a connection. It was strange, feeling connected to an alien, someone so different from him. But there it was, undeniable. He shifted slightly, glancing at the doorway as a gust of wind rattled the walls. The storm was still out there, waiting. They had to move, but Max knew he couldn't leave her behind again. He couldn't risk it. As he gathered his thoughts, Zyra spoke again, her voice stronger this time. "We can't stay here for long. The surge will find us." Max nodded, feeling the weight of her words. The Bioflare surge was unlike anything he had ever encountered. If they didn't get to a safe zone soon, they would be trapped. He stood up, moving toward his gear, mentally preparing himself for the next steps. Zyra's eyes followed him, and for the first time, she seemed to be studying him, not with the wary eyes of an enemy, but with something else. It was as though she was trying to figure him out. "You're not like the others," she said quietly, her voice tinged with a hint of curiosity. Max paused, glancing back at her. "What do you mean?" Zyra looked away for a moment, then back at him. "You didn't just save me because you had to. You saved me because you wanted to." Max's chest tightened. He didn't know how to respond to that. He wasn't sure why he had saved her, not really. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was something more. But whatever it was, it had already changed the course of everything. And now, they were bound together by that choice. As Max secured his gear, ready to move, he turned back to Zyra, offering her a hand. "We need to get moving. Can you stand?" She hesitated for a moment, then nodded, slowly pushing herself into a sitting position. Her legs were shaky, but she managed to stand with his help. Together, they stepped toward the shelter's exit, the storm still raging outside, but with a renewed determination in both their steps. They were no longer just two strangers caught in a storm. They were survivors, and together, they would face whatever came next. Max and Zyra moved quickly, their steps hurried but deliberate. The air outside the shelter was thick with the stinging energy of the Bioflare surge, the heat still pressing down on them even as they made their way through the desolate landscape. Max could feel the intense heat radiating off the ground, the temperature rising as the surge continued to wreak havoc. His suit systems were working overtime to keep him cool, but it was clear that they didn't have much time before the flare would catch up to them again. Zyra's strides were slow but steady, her silver hair trailing behind her like a beacon in the turbulent winds. Max had offered to help her more, but she had insisted that she could manage. Despite the faint traces of exhaustion in her eyes, she moved with a grace that seemed almost effortless. "We need to reach the outpost," Zyra said, her voice steady despite the urgency in her words. Max glanced at her, nodding. "I know. I'm trying to keep an eye on the storm, but it's getting hard to track." Zyra looked ahead, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. "I can sense it," she said, her voice low, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. "The surge is shifting. It's getting closer." Max's heart tightened at her words. He had known they were being chased by the storm, but hearing her say it made it all too real. They were running out of time. "We'll make it," Max said, trying to offer reassurance, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. They had reached the edge of the barren landscape, where a small ridge led toward the outpost. The rocky terrain was a stark contrast to the smooth, desolate plain they had crossed. Max could feel the tension in the air, the hum of the surge growing louder in his ears. It was as if the very ground beneath them was alive with energy. "It's not far now," Max said, his voice tight. Zyra nodded, her expression focused, her pace quickening as she pushed herself forward. Max followed, trying to match her speed. As they crested the ridge, the outpost came into view, a small, isolated structure sitting on the edge of a rocky plateau. The building was surrounded by what looked like a force field, shimmering in the distance, but it was hard to tell if it was still functional. The storm was pushing closer, the Bioflare surge swirling like a living thing, its energy reaching out toward them. "We're almost there," Max said, his voice strained as he urged himself to move faster. Zyra looked at the outpost, her eyes narrowing. "If the surge reaches us before we get inside, it'll be too late." Max didn't need to hear more. He sprinted forward, Zyra at his side, her steps graceful but urgent. They reached the entrance of the outpost, but to Max's horror, the force field flickered, then sputtered out completely, leaving the door wide open. "It's not good," Zyra said, her voice calm despite the panic creeping into her expression. Max reached for his communicator, but before he could speak, a crackling sound filled the air. The Bioflare surge was upon them. A wave of searing heat rolled over the outpost like a tidal wave, its energy crackling through the air. Max shielded his face, but it was useless. The surge had already reached them, and the force of it slammed into his chest, knocking him to the ground. Zyra was thrown to the side, her body twisting as she hit the dirt. Max scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the storm raged around them. He could barely see through the blinding heat, but he knew they had to get inside, or they wouldn't survive. "Zyra," he called, his voice strained as he stumbled toward her. She was struggling to rise, her movement slow and labored, but she was still conscious. "Max," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We don't have much time." Max reached her side, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her toward the open door of the outpost. The storm was still swirling around them, but the closer they got to the entrance, the more Max felt the heat fading. They were almost there. With one final push, Max managed to drag Zyra into the shelter of the outpost. The door slammed shut behind them, sealing them inside. Max collapsed against the wall, his body shaking with exhaustion. He could hear Zyra's labored breathing beside him. They had made it. For now, at least. But the storm was still out there, its fury relentless. Max didn't know how long they could stay hidden, but for the moment, he was just thankful to be alive. He looked over at Zyra, who was sitting against the wall, her silver eyes reflecting the faint light of the shelter. She had her back to him, but Max could see the exhaustion in her posture. She was still recovering, but he could tell she was stronger than she appeared. "Thank you," Zyra whispered, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. Max nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. "We're in this together." The storm outside raged on, its fury still pressing against the walls of the outpost. Max sat against the wall, his body aching from the strain of the Bioflare surge, but there was a strange sense of relief now that they were inside. The heat of the storm was gone, but the tension remained. Zyra was still sitting beside him, her breathing steady but slow as she gathered her strength. Max looked at her, his mind racing with thoughts of their next move. They couldn't stay here forever. The shelter was small, and while it offered some protection, it wouldn't keep them safe for long. The Bioflare surge had already shown them how powerful it was, and it wasn't likely to stop until it had done its damage. "We need to get to higher ground," Max said quietly, breaking the silence. Zyra turned her head toward him, her eyes focused but tired. "Higher ground?" she asked. "Yes," Max replied. "There's a ridge about 3 miles to the north. It's the highest point in the area, and it might give us a better view of the storm and our surroundings." Zyra nodded slowly, her mind processing the plan. "You're right," she said after a moment. "We need to move. But we can't just leave now. The surge is still too close." Max glanced at the door, his mind still on the Bioflare surge. He knew it would be risky to leave, but they couldn't stay here forever. "We'll rest for a bit longer," Max said. "Then we'll make a move." They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the faint hum of the shelter's systems. Max let his eyes wander around the small room, noting the minimal supplies and the bare walls. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. Zyra's voice broke the silence. "Thank you," she said softly. Max turned his head toward her, his brow furrowed. "For what?" he asked, confused. "For saving me," she said, her voice low but filled with gratitude. Max felt his chest tighten, the weight of her words settling heavily on him. "You don't have to thank me," he said, shaking his head. "I did what anyone would do." Zyra met his gaze, her eyes shining with a mixture of admiration and something deeper, something Max couldn't quite place. "Not everyone would have done what you did," she said. Max felt a sudden rush of warmth spread through him. He wasn't used to being thanked, especially not in a situation like this. He didn't feel like a hero, he just felt like someone who had done what was necessary. "We're in this together," he said simply. Zyra nodded, her lips curling into a small smile. "Together," she repeated. Max stood up, stretching his legs and glancing at the door. "Let's move," he said, determination in his voice. "We'll get to the ridge, figure out our next step." Zyra stood as well, her movement slow but deliberate. She didn't need to say anything, Max could tell she was ready. They made their way to the door, and Max hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the shelter. It felt like a temporary refuge, a moment of peace before the storm would undoubtedly return. But they couldn't stay here forever. The ridge was their next destination, and Max knew they had to get there soon. He opened the door and stepped outside, the harsh winds from the Bioflare surge still howling through the air. The landscape outside was just as desolate as before, but now it felt even more dangerous. The storm was closer, its energy crackling in the atmosphere. Max shielded his eyes from the swirling dust and debris, his hand gripping the edge of the door as he waited for Zyra to catch up. She was right behind him, her eyes scanning the horizon, her posture steady despite the intense conditions. Max felt a surge of respect for her, she had been through so much already, and yet she was still standing strong. "This way," he said, pointing toward the ridge. They began their trek, their steps heavy in the swirling wind, but determined. Max's thoughts kept returning to the storm. It felt alive, unpredictable, as though it was following them, hunting them. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being tracked, that the surge wasn't just a random event but something far more dangerous. He pushed those thoughts aside for now. They had to keep moving forward. The wind picked up again, and Zyra stumbled slightly as a gust hit them head-on. Max reached out instinctively, grabbing her arm to steady her. She looked at him, surprised by the gesture, but said nothing. "You okay?" he asked, his voice firm but concerned. Zyra nodded, though her eyes looked distant. "I'm fine," she replied, though Max could hear the faint tremor in her voice. He didn't push the matter further, they both knew the danger they were in. With every step they took, the ridge seemed to get farther away, the storm pressing harder against them. Max's muscles burned from the exertion, but he kept moving, his gaze fixed on the rocky incline ahead. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the base of the ridge. Max's heart raced with relief, but there was no time to rest. They had to climb. Zyra was already moving ahead, her long legs carrying her up the incline with ease. Max followed closely behind, his mind focused on the task at hand. The storm was still behind them, but now they had to face the climb. It wasn't going to be easy. But it was their only chance. As they ascended, Max could feel the wind picking up, the storm swirling more violently below them. He glanced at Zyra, her blue skin glowing faintly in the dim light, and for the first time, he realized just how much they had come to rely on each other. Together, they were stronger. And that gave him hope. As they reached the top of the ridge, Max paused, looking out over the desolate land. The storm was still there, but now they had a better view of it. And as Max scanned the horizon, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. A flicker of movement in the distance. It was hard to tell, but it looked like something was out there, waiting. Waiting for them. Max's eyes narrowed as he stared out across the barren wasteland. The storm was still raking the landscape with its destructive fury, but in the distance, he could make out the shape of something, or someone. It was hard to say with the dust and debris swirling in the air, but the movement was unmistakable. He wasn't imagining it. "Zyra," Max said, his voice low but firm. "Do you see that?" Zyra had already noticed, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon with the precision of a seasoned warrior. She stood silently for a moment, her gaze locked on the figure in the distance. "I see it," she replied, her voice steady but with a hint of caution. Max felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had been hoping to avoid any more trouble, but this felt different. The figure wasn't moving like the storm's chaos, it was purposeful, deliberate. "What is it?" Max asked, his tone more to himself than to Zyra. "I don't know," she replied, stepping closer to him, her tall figure looming beside him. "But it's not natural. We need to approach with care." Max nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He was tired, every part of his body aching from the long trek and the relentless storm, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. Something was waiting for them out there. The wind howled louder, a constant reminder that the Bioflare surge was still surging, still out of control. But now, the unknown figure in the distance was a new threat, or perhaps, a new ally. Max wasn't sure. They had no choice but to approach. Slowly, they made their way forward, their steps cautious as the landscape seemed to shift with every gust of wind. The closer they got to the figure, the clearer it became that it was humanoid. A person. Or at least, something that resembled a person. As they approached, Max's breath caught in his throat. It was another alien, a female. Her skin was a deep shade of red, unlike anything Max had ever seen, with dark markings that seemed to pulse under the storm's strange light. She was standing still, facing them directly. Her eyes gleamed with an unsettling intensity, and her posture was calm, yet the air around her felt charged, like she was waiting for something, or someone. Max stopped in his tracks, his instincts kicking in. Zyra was still beside him, her posture tense, but she didn't move. "Who are you?" Max called out, his voice strong and steady despite the fear gnawing at him. The alien woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as though studying him, her eyes never leaving his. Her presence felt alien, unlike anything Max had encountered. There was a strange power about her, an aura that seemed to resonate with the very air around them. Finally, she spoke, her voice surprisingly soft but carrying an undeniable authority. "I am Liara of the Red Legion," she said, her words deliberate, measured. "You are far from your home, human." Max blinked, taken aback by her calm demeanor. "How do you know I'm human?" he asked, his hand instinctively going to the sidearm he had holstered. Zyra stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "Who are you, really?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. Liara's gaze shifted to Zyra, and for a moment, Max could see a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "I know your kind," Liara said, her voice now tinged with something that Max couldn't quite place. "I've seen the warriors of your people. You fight like no other species." She turned back to Maximum and you. "You are different. The surge doesn't affect you the way it affects others, does it?" Max frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" he asked. Liara's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "You're not like the others. You are the one who can survive the storm. You have something inside you that draws it to you." Max's heart skipped a beat. The surge. The storm had been following them. It was almost as if it was tracking them, and now, this alien woman was suggesting that he was the reason. That he was somehow connected to it. "What are you saying?" Max asked, his voice tense. Liara looked at him for a long moment before responding. "You are the key," she said simply. "The storm is not just a natural disaster. It is a force of nature. A bioflare surge, yes. But also something more. It is drawn to you, human." Max shook his head, his mind racing. "I don't understand." "Why me?" Liara stepped closer, her eyes piercing through him as though searching for something deep inside. "Because you are not just any human. You are a catalyst. And this storm, this surge, is only the beginning." The air around them seemed to grow heavier, the storm's roar in the distance almost muted by the intensity of the moment. Max could feel his heart racing. Everything he thought he knew was starting to unravel. Zyra stepped forward, her eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and concern. "What do you want from us?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. Liara's gaze flickered to her, then back to Maximum. "I want nothing from you," she said softly. "But the storm. It has chosen you. And you will face the consequences of that choice." Max's chest tightened at her words. He had no idea what she meant, but the way she said it sent a shiver down his spine. He had been trying to outrun the storm, but now it seemed like there was no escaping it. He was part of something bigger, something he didn't understand. And as Liara's gaze lingered on him, he knew that this was only the beginning of whatever came next. Max stood in silence, trying to process everything Liara had said. The storm, the bioflare surge, it was all connected to him somehow. He could feel his heart racing, his mind overwhelmed by the weight of her words. The storm had chosen him. He was a catalyst. What did that even mean? He turned to Zyra, who stood beside him, her expression unreadable. He could sense the uncertainty in her, too. She had always been the warrior, the one with the answers, but even she seemed lost now. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating, as if the very ground beneath them was alive with energy. The storm outside still raged, but now it felt closer than ever. Max couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for something. Waiting for him. "So, what now?" Max asked, his voice hoarse. He didn't even know if he was asking Liara or Zyra. Liara's gaze flickered to him, her eyes glowing with an intensity that was almost hypnotic. "Now, you face the storm," she said simply. Max frowned. "What does that mean?" Liara stepped forward, her red skin glowing faintly in the dim light. "It means that you are the key to stopping it. The storm is not just a natural occurrence, it is a force of nature, yes, but it is also a consequence of something much larger. Something that you are connected to." Max's mind raced. The storm was connected to him? How could that be? "I don't understand," he said, shaking his head. Why me? Zyra finally spoke, her voice steady but filled with concern. What is this force you're talking about? Liara turned her gaze to her, her eyes narrowing slightly. The surge is the result of a disruption in the balance. It is the manifestation of an ancient power, one that has been dormant for centuries. And you, human, are the one who has awakened it. Max felt a chill run down his spine. He had always been just a soldier, a simple man doing his duty. How could he possibly be responsible for something like this? I didn't ask for this, he said, his voice tight. I'm not some chosen one. Liara's gaze softened slightly, though her expression remained serious. You didn't choose it, but it is yours now, she said. And you must learn to control it, or it will destroy you. Max's stomach twisted at her words. Destroy him? What did that even mean? He had no idea how to control anything, let alone a force like this. So what's the plan? He asked, trying to steady his voice. How do I stop this? Liara's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. First, you must understand the power you hold, she said. Only then will you be able to use it. Max looked at her, his heart heavy with doubt. How could he possibly understand something he didn't even know existed? How could he stop something as powerful as the surge? But he knew one thing for certain, he couldn't run from it. Not anymore. The storm had found him. And now, it was his responsibility to face it. He glanced at Zyra, who was still watching him closely. Her eyes were filled with something, maybe hope, maybe fear, but she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Max nodded to himself, a sense of determination settling over him. All right, he said, his voice steady. Let's do it. Let's figure out what I need to do. Liara studied him for a moment, then nodded in approval. Good, she said. The first step is to train. You need to understand how to harness the surge, how to control the energy before it controls you. Max took a deep breath, pushing away the doubt that still lingered. He didn't know what this training would entail or how he could possibly control something as unpredictable as a bioflare surge, but he had no other choice. He had to try. He looked out over the barren landscape, the storm still swirling in the distance. The sky was darkening, but the storm didn't seem to relent. Where do we start? He asked. Liara turned to face him fully, her expression unreadable. We start by understanding the energy, she said. The surge is not just destruction. It is power. And power can be shaped, controlled, and redirected. But first, you must learn to feel it. Max's chest tightened as he processed her words. Feel it? How could he even begin to understand something as intangible as that? But he couldn't back down now. The storm was coming for him, and for Zyra, and for everything around them. There was no time to waste. All right, he said again, more firmly this time. Let's start. Zyra stepped forward, her tall frame looming beside him. I'll help you, she said quietly, her voice filled with an unusual sense of resolve. Max looked at her, surprised by her willingness. She had always been the one to fight, to act. But now, it seemed like she was ready to stand by him in this. And for the first time since all of this had started, Max felt like he wasn't facing it alone. They were in this together. And no matter how impossible it seemed, they were going to find a way to stop the surge. They had to. For their survival. For the future. Max stood still, feeling the weight of Liara's words settle heavily on his shoulders. The surge was something more than just a storm, it was a force of nature, and he was somehow tied to it. But how? How could he control something he didn't even fully understand? Zyra, standing beside him, seemed to sense his doubts, her sharp gaze never leaving him. She stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. We'll figure this out, she said. But we need to start now. Max nodded, grateful for her presence, for the strength she always seemed to exude. She had always been the one to take charge in a fight, but now, it was different. They weren't fighting a physical enemy, they were fighting an unknown force, something that could be as unpredictable as the storm itself. "Let's begin," Max said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty churning in his stomach. Liara watched them both, her eyes flicking between them with a measured intensity. "The first step is to feel the energy," she said, her voice like a quiet command. "You must open yourself to it, let it flow through you." Max raised an eyebrow. "Feel it? How am I supposed to do that?" Liara gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "The surge is not just destruction. It is energy. Every living thing has energy flowing through it. But the surge, it is a power unlike anything you've encountered." Max stood still, trying to concentrate, but all he could hear was the wind howling outside, the distant rumble of the storm. He closed his eyes, focusing on the sensation in his chest. He felt his heartbeat, steady and rhythmic. He felt his breath, shallow but calming. But there was nothing else. No surge, no energy. "I don't feel anything," he said after a long moment. Liara nodded, as if expecting his response. "The surge doesn't just reveal itself. You must attune yourself to it. Think of it like a song. At first, you hear nothing but static. But as you listen, you begin to pick out the notes, the rhythm." Max frowned. He had always been a man of action, not someone to sit around and feel things. But Liara was right. They had no other choice. "All right," Max said, taking a deep breath. "Let's try it again." This time, he focused more intently, letting the sound of the wind fade away as he closed his eyes, blocking out everything except for the beat of his heart and the steady rhythm of his breath. Zyra stood a few feet away, watching him with a look of quiet concern. She was always so composed, but Max knew she was worried. This was uncharted territory for both of them. The moment stretched on, seconds, minutes, Max couldn't tell. But then, just as he was about to give up, he felt it. A slight tingling at the edges of his consciousness, something that was not quite physical but still there. It was faint, but it was there. The surge. The power that Liara had spoken of. It was like a pulse, a vibration in the air itself. Max focused on it, drawing it in, letting it move through him. At first, it felt like a distant hum, like a low vibration he could barely hear. But as he concentrated, it grew louder, clearer. His pulse quickened, his body humming with the energy that he had just begun to understand. "I feel it," he said, his voice quiet but filled with awe. Liara nodded, her expression still serious. "Good. Now, focus. Let the energy flow through you, but don't let it consume you. You must be its master, not the other way around." Max swallowed hard. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this, but there was no turning back now. He focused more intently, letting the energy swirl around him. At first, it felt overwhelming, like the storm outside. But with every breath, he focused, trying to control it, to bend it to his will. It wasn't easy. His mind kept drifting, and the energy slipped away, leaving him with a feeling of emptiness. But he kept going, pushing himself to stay connected to it, to feel it within him. He had to. They had no other choice. Zyra stepped forward, her eyes still fixed on him. "You're doing it," she said quietly, her voice filled with something like hope. Max didn't respond. He was too focused on the energy now, feeling it move through him, gathering in his hands like a spark ready to ignite. It was like holding fire in his palms, hot and dangerous, but under his control. Max opened his eyes, his breath coming faster. He was sweating now, his body trembling from the effort. But the energy was still there, alive within him. He had done it. For the first time, he felt the surge not as a destructive force, but as something he could wield. Liara's voice broke through his concentration. "Good. Now, let it go." Max blinked, confused. "Let it go," he repeated, his mind still buzzing with the power inside him. "Release it. The surge will only stay with you if you control it. If you hold on too tightly, it will slip through your fingers, and it will turn on you." Max hesitated. He didn't want to let it go. It felt like he had finally grasped something that had eluded him for so long. But Liara was right. He had to learn to release it. Slowly, he let his hands drop, the energy slipping away from him like water running through his fingers. For a moment, he felt empty, like something vital had been taken from him. But then, he opened his eyes, and the world seemed clearer. The storm outside still raged, but the energy was no longer something he feared. It was something he could control. "I can do this," he said quietly, his voice filled with a new sense of purpose. Zyra nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You're not alone in this," she said, her voice steady. Max looked at her, feeling a sense of gratitude wash over him. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. They had each other, and they had the power to face whatever the storm brought next. Max stood on the edge of the ridge, the wind whipping around them, carrying the hum of the Bioflare surge as it continued its relentless path across the land. The storm, though no longer directly over them, was still alive, swirling and pulsing with energy. His body was still buzzing from the earlier surge, the power within him something he had just begun to control. Zyra stood next to him, her posture calm despite the chaos around them, her silver eyes scanning the horizon. Max knew the question she was thinking, what now? The answer wasn't clear. They had learned how to control the surge, but they had no idea how to stop it. The path ahead was uncertain, but Max knew one thing for sure: he couldn't face it alone. He turned to Zyra, his voice steady but filled with determination. "We need to find out where it's coming from. We need to understand the source of the surge if we're going to stop it." Zyra nodded, her expression serious. "Agreed. But first, we need to get out of the open. The storm could shift again, and we don't want to be caught unprepared." Max looked back at the outpost in the distance, the only shelter they had found so far. It was small, remote, but it had kept them safe for now. "We'll head back to the outpost. Regroup, then make a plan," he said. Zyra didn't protest. She knew it was the smartest choice. The last thing they needed was to get caught in the open when the surge returned. As they made their way back, Max couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The surge, the storm, it was all too perfect, too precise. It was almost as if it was following them, reacting to their every move. He glanced at Zyra, who seemed lost in thought, her brow furrowed in concentration. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his voice quiet. Zyra met his gaze, her eyes flickering with concern. "I'm thinking that the surge is more than just a natural phenomenon. It's like it's alive, like it's responding to us." "To you?" Max's chest tightened. He had felt it, too. The surge seemed to move with purpose, as if it was targeting them. "But why?" "I've been thinking the same thing," Max said. "The storm isn't random. It's drawn to something. And I think that something is me." Zyra's eyes hardened. "You're the catalyst," she said softly, the words weighing heavily in the air. Max nodded, feeling the truth of it settle deep inside him. He was the reason the surge was here. And he was the only one who could stop it. But how? He asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. "How do I stop something like this?" Zyra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the outpost. "We'll figure it out," she said finally, her voice steady. "But first, we need to make sure we're not walking straight into the storm's path." Max followed her eyes, his mind already working through the possibilities. They could hide in the outpost, wait for the storm to pass. But deep down, he knew that wouldn't work. The surge was not just a natural disaster, it was a force, and forces like that didn't just fade away. "We need to get to the source of it," he said again, more firmly this time. Zyra turned to face him, her eyes narrowing with determination. "And we will," she said. "But we'll need to be smart. If we're going to survive this, we need to learn everything we can about the surge. About what it wants, and how it works." Max felt a rush of determination surge through him. He had to stop it. The thought of the storm raging unchecked, of it destroying everything in its path, was something he couldn't bear. "Let's go back to the outpost, gather what we can, and then head out," he said. "We can't waste any more time." They reached the outpost soon after, the shelter offering a brief respite from the relentless storm. Max stepped inside, feeling the weight of the past few hours settle into his bones. But there was no time to rest. The storm was still out there, and it wasn't going to wait. Zyra followed him in, her movement silent but purposeful. "We'll need supplies," Max said, his voice steady as he surveyed the small interior of the outpost. "And information. If we're going to track the surge, we need to understand it." Zyra nodded, already moving to gather what they needed. Max's thoughts raced. The surge was something he couldn't control completely yet, but he had learned to feel it. And that was the first step. Now, he needed to find out where it was coming from, and why. The energy in the air was still thick, the storm's vibrations pulsing around them like an unspoken warning. It wasn't over yet. Max knew they were walking into something far bigger than themselves. But they didn't have a choice. They had to face it. And together, they would. As he glanced over at Zyra, her determination mirroring his own, Max knew that they could handle whatever came next. They were in this together, and that was all that mattered. The storm had chosen him, but with Zyra by his side, they would face it head-on. And this time, they would be ready. Max and Zyra had gathered what little they could from the outpost, preparing for the journey ahead. The storm still loomed, its presence felt in the air, but now, they had a purpose. Max knew the only way to stop the surge was to understand it, to find its source and control it before it consumed everything in its path. With his newfound connection to the surge, he felt a weight in his chest, an understanding that he had to face whatever came next. The wind outside howled, pushing against the walls of the outpost, but they were ready. The gear was packed, the map laid out. Zyra moved around him with her usual quiet efficiency, her eyes scanning every detail, every shadow, as if anticipating something to emerge from the depths of the storm. "We need to move fast," Max said, his voice steady, despite the uncertainty swirling within him. Zyra nodded, already heading toward the door. Max followed, his mind sharp, but the gnawing question still lingered: why was the surge targeting him? What made him different from the others? They stepped outside, the wind instantly tugging at their clothes. The storm was closer now, the sky darkened by swirling clouds. There was no time to waste. They had a long journey ahead, and Max knew they couldn't afford to wait for the storm to settle. The storm wasn't just a force of nature, it was alive, and it was after them. Max's body still buzzed with the energy of the surge, a feeling of power he had never known before. He wasn't sure if it was a blessing or a curse, but he couldn't deny the weight it carried. Zyra walked beside him, her steps measured, but her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, watching for any sign of danger. They had become more than just allies in this, there was an unspoken bond between them now, forged in the fire of survival. "Keep your focus," Zyra said, her voice calm but firm. Max turned to her, surprised by the urgency in her tone. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she pointed to the distance, where the land sloped into a darkened valley, the swirling winds creating a dangerous path through jagged rocks. "That's the way we need to go," she said, her eyes narrowing. "It's the quickest route to the source." Max looked ahead, the valley dark and treacherous. "And what exactly are we expecting to find there?" Zyra met his gaze. "The storm," she said simply. "It's not just a natural event. It's being controlled. If we can get to the heart of it, we can stop it." Max felt a chill crawl down his spine. Controlled. The surge had a mind of its own, but someone was directing it. That meant whoever, or whatever, was behind this had even more power than they had imagined. "Let's go then," Max said, determination filling his voice. They moved toward the valley, the wind pushing harder against them with each step. Max's body felt the strain of the journey, but he kept going, the surge still humming through him, fueling his resolve. The closer they got to the valley, the more the storm seemed to react, as if it sensed their presence, drawing them in. The ground beneath their feet grew unstable, and Max's boot slipped on loose rocks, but Zyra moved with ease, her body adapting to the harsh terrain. She didn't speak, but Max could feel her steady presence, like a constant force beside him. They reached the edge of the valley, the wind howling around them. Max stopped for a moment, his breath shallow as he surveyed the landscape ahead. The storm was getting closer, but there was something else, something he couldn't quite place. A feeling in the air, like static, buzzing in his chest. "It's close," Max said, his voice barely audible over the wind. Zyra nodded. "We'll make it. Together." Max turned to her, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. "Together." It wasn't just a word, it was a promise. With that, they continued their trek through the valley, their path growing darker as they ventured deeper into the heart of the storm. Every step felt like they were walking into the unknown, but Max knew that they had to keep moving. They had no other choice. The source of the surge was out there, and they were going to find it, no matter what it took. As they moved further into the valley, the air grew thicker, the storm's energy pressing down on them like a weight. Max could feel it now, the surge pulling at him, trying to drag him deeper into its grasp. He resisted it, holding on to his resolve, but the pull was undeniable. "We're almost there," Zyra said, her voice barely audible over the wind. Max nodded, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. They had no idea what they would find, but they were ready to face it. Together.